Hello, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Kroger. Glad to have you with us on what is a rainy Friday for us, but looking forward to a weekend and looking forward to seeing Georgia in the mix for some big-time recruits here. Jeff Sintel is going to tell us more about that on today's show. That is going to be a lot of fun. We'll also talk about kind of what's been seen, what's been spotted at Georgia spring practice. I thought Connor Riley from DawgNation had an unbelievable practice report yesterday, looking deep at all of that. If you're the kind of person that likes those little peeks inside what's happening at UGA practice, well, you got some really good stuff from Connor on that. We're going to talk about a brief glimpse of what he wrote at DawgNation.com on today's show, and it's kind of a follow-up to a topic we addressed the other day here around our program. Also, not too early to start thinking about some of the big games around the SEC here this year. We will do some of that before we're done, and we'll talk about a really cool thing that happened on DawgNation earlier this week as Nolan Smith sat down for an exclusive interview. We'll react to some of that with Jeff Sintel on today's program there as well. It is a busy Friday. We are not sleeping in, even though it's raining. We're ready to go and glad to have you with us as we do. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Kroger, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I think most of you would probably agree that this is kind of one of the absolute best times of the year to be a sports fan. That we've got an NCAA tournament going on, and even though I probably don't follow college basketball quite as closely as I used to, this is still a great event, and I'd love for Georgia to be back a part of it on the men's side again at some point in time in the future. But even if Georgia's not there, there is just something about March Madness that delivers each and every year. Yesterday's an example of that. We're also at that time of year. We're kind of post-players heading towards the Masters. Really fun time of year to be a golf fan. You've got Major League Baseball, the start of that right around the corner, where a lot of us are Braves fans, and that's always a lot of fun to think about there as well. As the weather starts to warm up, and hopefully we'll get there and stay there here at some point in time, but as the weather starts to warm up, it is just a great time of year to be a sports fan. Most of us kind of agree with that. Most sports fans kind of agree with that statement. But for the audience of this show and me as the host of this show, there's also an element of which, hey, when you're making a list of the things that make this sporting time of year great, there's a lot of college football that's a part of that there as well. Maybe the kind of average mainstream person living some other part of the country, they may not quite realize that. But we also love this time of year for spring practice, getting those updates. We're going to do some of that on our show here coming up in just a couple of moments, what we're learning thus far from a couple of practices so far in Georgia spring. We like that about this time of year, and we also like the fact that the warm weather season, spring turning into summer, has also become about the hottest time of the year, no pun intended, for recruiting classes. That the month of June ends up being your kind of prime time for official visits in a way that in a previous iteration of the recruiting calendar probably would have happened much later than that. Now a lot of that action is in the month of June, and laying the groundwork for those official visits and eventual commitments and big decisions is a lot of the action that goes on right now, including this upcoming weekend here for Georgia, the weekend that is upon us. Now, when Jeff Sintel joins us for his weekly conversation with us coming up in a few minutes, we're going to talk more about this. But I want to lay some of the groundwork for that conversation with all of you right now by reminding you that this weekend, five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola is going to be taking a visit to Georgia. And we have reason to believe, even though there's been some online chatter as of late connecting Raiola USC, and obviously there's the deep family connection that would connect Raiola to Nebraska, the former Ohio State commit, I think is also, rightly so, I believe, viewed to be heavily considering Georgia too. And despite the kind of obvious connections to USC and Nebraska, I think there are a lot of smart folks who would say that, and this is, to be frank, a little bit of a surprise to me, when Raiola decommitted from Ohio State, I don't know how serious I kind of took Georgia's chance of getting back involved with him. I was sort of led to believe that when Raiola chose the Ohio State the first time, that the Georgia bridge may have been burned there at that particular time, but it seems like Mike Bobo in this case has actually done a really good job of holding on to maintaining that relationship. So as Raiola takes this visit to Georgia this weekend, the sense that you get is this is far more than just a sightseeing opportunity. This is far more than just some sort of tourist, it's not a vacation necessarily for Raiola. He is coming to UGA to truly kick the tires and imagining himself as potentially being a part of this program and continuing the legacy that's been created here by back-to-back national championships. Raiola is taking the opportunity to be a part of all of this seemingly pretty seriously. We have some evidence that proves that. Carr is a very impressive Georgia wide receiver commit from down in Colquitt County. This is one of those sort of big-time in-state names to know here for this recruiting cycle. And in the case of Georgia, thankfully already in the mix as a part of this 2024 class, and also already doing some recruiting on behalf of his future school. In fact, here's what he put out on Twitter the other day. With all the talk about, Raiola potentially going to USC, or the Nebraska folks who feel like that family tie and I guess maybe their own ability to, conjure up some NIL cash, that might eventually win out for Dylan. What Carr says is, I'm just going to let them figure things out, but we're locked in. He calls it La Familia, basically meaning family. I'm not very bilingual, but even I know what La Familia is. Family, Carr says, with Dylan Raiola. Apparently the photo here is from like a FaceTime chat that Carr was doing with Raiola. If you look up there at the top right-hand corner of the screen, you can see the other side of that conversation. So Carr and Raiola having that discussion together, it's certainly, if you want to kind of start sort of trying to figure out and piece together all the details here, you'd say, the kind of thing that a quarterback who was strongly considering a school would do is have those sort of FaceTime conversations, those sort of regular discussions with guys like Carr, who are wide receivers that he would be throwing to if he went to a place like UGA. So my point here in starting off today's show is to tell you, as you look ahead to the Dylan Raiola visit to Georgia this weekend, take it seriously as a real chance for Georgia in person for the first time in a little while here. I think Jeff has told us this, that the last time that Raiola visited in person was the Kentucky game in 2021, so it's been a little while here. I may have my facts slightly off on that, but I believe I'm right. Kentucky game 2021, the last in-person visit for Raiola to Georgia. I believe that's the case. So obviously this becomes a pretty important visit, and it's a visit that the Raiola camp seems to be taking pretty seriously. Their chance to see what Georgia's all about, and obviously getting more acquainted with some of those Georgia commits, a part of Raiola's process on this there as well. Now, before we hear more from Jeff on what could go down with Dylan here this weekend, setting the stage for what might be an official visit right here at the beginning of June, let's go back and hear Dylan in his own words from a few weeks ago. Jeff was out in Arizona. That's the home state for Raiola, talking about the recruiting process, talking about how Dylan wants a second chance after realizing that Ohio State's not the right place for him. And at least we can say this, he's certainly pretty smart if he's rejecting the Buckeyes, because we like the idea of rejecting Ohio State around here these days. But nonetheless, Dylan Raiola with Jeff Sintel on his recruiting process, where things stood a few weeks ago, setting the stage for some new information to be gained by being in Athens this weekend. Here is the five-star quarterback.
I think just the relationships and, just really seeing every school and what they have to offer. For me, really coming down to relationships. You can show winning, you can show scheme, but, you can't fake, being who you are and who you are all the time. So just really getting to know the coaches at each school that I'm looking at, and really just trusting my family.
How much will your first commitment experience shape your next one?
I think that's big. I'm lucky I get a second chance at it. I just want to be patient and really see what every school has to offer, and just make the best decision for me.
Georgia is obviously one of the schools you've thought about for some time. They were your first offer.
Yep.
How do you feel about them right now? Like, what has them in the mix?
Yeah, I think you got to start with the leader, Coach Smart. What he does for his program, for his players, the development he has. It's really just you can't beat what he does.
So listen, I think that obviously it's easy to want to gravitate towards the end of that conversation, and we'll get there, obviously, what Dylan said about Georgia, but it's the first part of that always kind of sticks out to me, because I think that Dylan Raiola is an example of something that probably exists with a lot of different recruits, where I think the process of taking visits and the process of making evaluations about the right school for you is actually probably a little bit more difficult than we realize. Because put yourself in this position for a moment. If you're Dylan, you're only visiting places like Georgia or Ohio State or USC. These are big-time college football programs. And if you're a big-time quarterback visiting a big-time program, you don't think that program is capable of putting on a really good face and making everything look really shiny and polished every single time you walk on that campus? That's what these programs do. And when everybody's kind of doing that kind of thing, it's almost like, everybody's on their best behavior on the first day. When every program that you visit is making this really effective recruiting pitch and it becomes its own kind of advertisement, I would imagine it's kind of hard to separate fact from fiction and say, okay, what is the real truth here? Because everything looks good on the basis of a short-term visit, but what's going to still look good over the course of the long haul? And a guy like Dylan's now been engaged in his recruiting process a little bit, and you can kind of gauge from that it seems like he's getting a little bit more seasoned in terms of making the evaluation of what's truly right for him. And these are all big-time programs, and USC wins with plenty of quarterbacks. Even Nebraska, I think, moving forward, Matt Rule is going to probably be a little bit more of a player on the recruiting trail than it's been in the past. Clearly, Georgia's won its share of recruiting battles, but it seems like Raiola is getting a little bit more comfortable with his ability to make the right choice for him, which I think is kind of an interesting process to watch evolve. And obviously, he said some really good things about Georgia there, in particular Kirby Smart and the role that he's done there. It seems like Raiola, and Jeff's told this before, and you can kind of get a little bit of a whiff of this from the comments that he makes, it seems like he's attracted to winning. And there's no doubt that if you want to be a winner, it's a place like Georgia you have to go. USC may win the Pac-12, but winning the Pac-12 is still a far cry from actually competing for a national championship. We've got lots of examples of that. You know, Nebraska, maybe they build themselves up into something better than they've been with Matt Rule, but they would have to build and build and build and build to even be competitive in the Big Ten, and being competitive in the Big Ten is not exactly being on the same plane as Georgia. We've seen that from the last couple of college football playoffs. Georgia's certainly done very well against top teams from the Big Ten. That if winning matters to you, there's really only one place to go to do some real winning, and that is a place like Georgia. How much will that matter to Raiola? We're about to find out. He's on campus this weekend. Georgia gets its chance to impress, maybe laying some groundworks and planting some seeds for an official visit that takes place later on this summer. But if you're a Georgia football fan, if you're a college football fan, one of the parts of the great sports calendar that we are in the midst of right now is the excitement of the recruiting cycle starting to pick up. Visitors on campus, more decisions coming, and a chance for Georgia under Kirby Smart to put together as good a recruiting class as the program has ever had. And certainly everybody in Athens would love for Dylan Raiola to be the centerpiece of all of that. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We are presented today by Kroger, and we're glad to have you with us. No matter how you get to us today, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app, 10 a.m. after that across all video platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We're on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we're available as a podcast, wherever you find them, Apple, Spotify, world-famous DawgNation.com, all kinds of ways to connect with the show. We're just really, really happy that you do that. And a huge thanks to our friends at Kroger for making it all possible. Listen, we love so much about Kroger, and one of the things that I love about them are the creative ways in which they kind of use like new technology and things like that to make your shopping experience more convenient, but also save you more money there as well. In fact, you've probably heard me talk before, but that membership program they have called Kroger Boost, well, now you get a chance to try Boost for free for 30 days. And when you do, you can find out how you can save up to $1,000 a year just by earning twice the fuel points by shopping there at Kroger, and also taking advantage of free grocery delivery there as well. Here's what Kroger understands, that the one thing we all have in common is, now listen, we're all different. We got different backgrounds. We live in different parts of the state, different parts of the world. We got different outlooks on life, whatever. But here's the one thing everybody's got in common. You don't have enough time. You don't have enough money. And so Kroger's going to try to save you time and money as it relates to Kroger Boost. Free grocery delivery, that's convenient. Twice the fuel points, that's putting more money back in your pocket. You love the idea of that, and you can try it for free for 30 days. So go to Kroger.com/boost for more on that. That's Kroger.com/boost for a lot more on that. So we talk recruiting off the top. We'll do more of that with Jeff Sintel coming up in just a moment. His thoughts on the Raiola visit, what that sets the stage for the next few weeks, including a return trip, possibly for an official visit there in June, and the kinds of players that could be drawn to Georgia because of Raiola. That is really good as well. But before all of that, let's go around the doghouse here for a moment, and let's talk about spring practice. A couple of practices in the books. We had some good stuff from Connor Riley at DawgNation.com, his eyewitness account of what he saw at UGA practice. We'll give you more of that in a moment, but how about Kirby Smart's own feeling about this? What he saw from his first practice, kind of the mood around the team as they get back to work and kind of try to cast their own identity here for this 2023 version of the Georgia Bulldogs, the one that hopes to go for 3 in 23, which we'll talk more about as we get closer to that. Smart from Pro Day the other day on how he feels about that very first practice of the Georgia Bulldogs. This is Kirby early evaluation of spring.
I'm excited about it. We had really good energy, enthusiasm, a little windy, so there wasn't like, we probably didn't have the kind of day you'd like to have in terms of passing the football, but with 25-mile-an-hour gusts, that probably had a big part of that, and I expected those guys to bounce back on that side. We didn't have pads on, so it's hard to evaluate that, but I did enjoy the energy, enthusiasm the guys had competing against each other.
The cool thing is, if you go to DawgNation.com, Connor's got a pretty detailed practice report up looking at the quarterbacks. I'd say that most of what he wrote is about what you'd expect. Typical, kind of typical order. Beck was going first. Vandergrift was going second. Stockton was going third. No surprise there. Mike Bobo right in the middle of all that. No surprise there. The other thing I noticed, if you go to the DawgNation.com story where the practice report is, of course, all of this is completely free, of course, at DawgNation.com. But there's also like a gallery. I have no idea how we do this, but there's like a gallery you can kind of scroll through at the top, and I think it's like 15 or so pictures of practice yesterday. You don't care about media stuff, but typically speaking, when media is allowed to view practice, they are oftentimes, most of the time, not allowed to take photographs. Now, you'll never take video again, but when it comes to like photos, yesterday photographs were also allowed too. So, what that means for you is if you go to DawgNation.com, you can see some fresh practice photographs. It's like a little thing that right at the top of the page, there's practice report. You can sort of scroll through there and see all of those photographs. You can kind of see some of the images of your own self of what practice looked like yesterday. But there was one aspect of what Connor noticed at practice that I wanted to pull out here just for a moment and make a little bit of a bigger deal about. And I want to go back in time to something we talked about a couple of weeks ago as a setup for all of this. I talked about what Mel Kiper, the ESPN draft analyst, who I swear has been working at ESPN for 100 years. He was doing this before I was even following football, and I guess he'll be doing it for the rest of humanity. Mel Kiper's been breaking down the NFL draft. And the other day, he had kind of an interesting evaluation of Nolan Smith. Now, here's what we know. Nolan Smith, based on the way that he's performed at Pro Day and things like that, has almost certainly played his way into the first round. And if you were Georgia, would you take 11 Nolan Smiths at whatever position you could put him at? Of course you would. Nolan Smith is just one of the top-end guys that's been at Georgia in really any era, but certainly in this back-to-back national championship era. However, there is one thing about Nolan Smith that NFL teams are going to be evaluating, and if you're a Georgia coach, Georgia fan, you kind of also have to think about this for your own program there as well. Let me give you Mel Kiper here for a moment on Nolan Smith, and it leads into something for this 2023 Georgia team. So what Kiper says about Nolan Smith is that NFL teams covet edge rushers. It's one of the positions they reach for most because of how important sacking quarterbacks are. Kiper says about Smith, he's got all the physical tools. Teams want an outside linebacker, but he had only 6.5 sacks over the past 2 seasons for Georgia and too often got swallowed up by defensive tackles. He has to develop more pass rush moves. That's Mel Kiper Jr. Talking about Nolan Smith. We had talked about this on the show a couple of weeks ago. Now, if Nolan were here, I believe he would say, yeah, that's true. Hey, I'm not the biggest edge rusher. I am battling against big offensive tackles. And yet, I think Nolan would also say, but look at all the other things that I did for my program. And he'd be right to say that. Nolan Smith was clearly a extraordinarily, almost invaluable player for Georgia. At the least, a very valuable player for Georgia, despite not having tons and tons of sacks. But the thing that he will be evaluated on at the NFL level is, can a smaller edge rusher type really get to the quarterback, which is something those NFL teams are going to need Nolan Smith to do. And moving forward at Georgia, there is a similar kind of evaluation going on. As I mentioned a moment ago, if you could have 11 Nolans, of course you'd want that, and you'd play him at whatever position you could just because of the physical and spiritual characteristics that he brings onto the football team. But if you want to really get after quarterbacks, then maybe being just a little bit bigger would be better. That ability to kind of shed those blockers, that ability to kind of get past that offensive tackle using a long frame to be able to do that. And it's interesting to note, after Georgia's been led by an outside linebacker, an edge rusher as we call him now, that was not necessarily big for his position, it seems like around Georgia that might be starting to change just a little bit. One particular blurb from Connor's practice report at DawgNation.com yesterday really jumped out at me. I want to read this to you. When it comes to the outside linebacker position, Connor says, speaking of those outside linebackers, while the group is young, it is noticeably bigger and longer. Now, isn't that interesting? Georgia getting bigger and longer at the outside linebacker spot. You got Gabe Harris, who had a little bit of a dust up yesterday with Pierce Spurlin. I I heard there was a lot of energy at the Georgia practice yesterday. I'll just leave it that way. I'll just leave it at that. So you got Gabe Harris joined by new arrivals Damon Wilson, Sam Mpemba, who all measuring at 6'4". Now you got Darius Smith, who's also a big guy. Connor calls C.J. Madden bulked up. He says this group certainly looks more physically imposing under Chidera Uzodiribe's leadership. I like some words there. Do you like physically imposing edge rushers? Do you like noticeably bigger and longer than Georgia's been before? I like all of that, making the edge rush spot, kind of one of the dominant parts of this Georgia defense, which I think by appearances in 2023 could look a lot more like the 2021 defense than maybe the 2022 defense. And I believe that is a really good thing. So that's a pretty good excerpt, a pretty good eyewitness account of what Connor saw from outside linebackers yesterday, which I think is really, really fun for the upcoming season. As far as the group overall, this is also a thing we talked to Chidera Uzodiribe back. We talked to him about this back in Los Angeles, part of the national championship, what he's seen from his group. This is obviously a group in 2022 that was challenged because of the injury to Nolan Smith. That they didn't have Nolan on the field late in the season. Some guys had to step up into bigger roles, and I think because of the adversity this position group dealt with, it's the kind of thing that Chidera would say, hey, I actually grew to learn more about my guys because of what I had to see from them over the course of that national championship season. And in L.A., this is what Uzodiribe said he had seen from his group over the course of the year.
Man, resilient, man. These guys work, regardless of who it is. These guys prepare like their numbers are going to be called whenever it is. And, unfortunate, but it's been fortunate, when a guy like Nolan goes down, you get to see a guy like Chaz Chambliss have to step up, and he shows that, hey, he's ready to play. And then in the games where guys like where Beefy has gone down and Marvin Jones has had to step up as well, you get to see that these guys, they take the preparation serious, and it's benefiting them when they step foot on the field. So, man, it's a resilient group for sure.
So I think that edge rush is just kind of becoming one of the most important positions, but it's also kind of like one of the most fun positions to talk about. It's just fun to watch these great athletes get after quarterbacks and wreak havoc and exist in backfields, so much. It was a big part of the big wins that Georgia got this past season. It may even be a bigger part of the story for Georgia here in 2023. Chidera Uzodiribe seems to like what he sees. Connor Riley gave you a pretty favorable eyewitness account watching practice yesterday, at least of the size, the specs this group brings to the table. And certainly that has a chance to be a big part of the overall team DNA for Georgia this season. I think that's a kind of a fun thing to consider. I love the names. I love the talent they bring to the table. I like their overall measurements, and I can't wait to see what they do together on the football field. That is Around the Doghouse here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger here today. Now, before we are done, there are a lot of big games starting to get some big conversation on the SEC. To be honest with you, some of this we're going to do on Monday on our show related to something that ESPN has said about a Georgia showdown later on in the fall against Tennessee. We're going to do some of that on Monday's show because I think it actually sets up for a pretty fun conversation. But some of the other big games that are getting some discussion, we'll talk about those before we're done on today's show. But for now, as we promised, 5-star quarterback in town. We're talking about that, but not the only big visitor to consider here. So we'll cover a lot of ground here with Jeff Sintel, our DawgNation recruiting insider, here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So it's Jeff Sintel here, DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. Jeff, we talked a lot about Dylan Raiola before you joined us, and let me tell you, and this is more as like a fan maybe than a media type person, but as a fan, here's the one thing I'm always trying to get to the bottom of when it comes to big time recruits. The one we're talking about right now is, of course, Dylan Raiola. Georgia as a program is of such a stature that almost every elite recruit at least wants to stop by Georgia. Almost every elite recruit at least wants the cachet of being in the mix for Georgia. This is just like that prestigious school, the way that Alabama once would have been, that prestigious school that you kind of validate yourself as a top prospect by having Georgia in your top 3, by having Georgia in your top 4, that Georgia's going to be at least somewhat connected to almost every elite prospect. So when an elite prospect visits, I'm always trying to get to the bottom of, is this real? Is this more than just a sightseeing trip? Is this more than just two big entities, player and program, spending a little bit of time with each other? Is there something more to this? And when I see Nikar tweeting out what he's tweeted, I know you put this in your a story about Dylan earlier this week at DawgNation.com. When I hear some of the ancillary chatter, I still don't know if Raiola is coming to Georgia, but I'm left to conclude this visit this weekend is a real thing. It is a real fact-finding mission for our Raiola and a chance for Georgia to impress a quarterback that is certainly seemingly giving Georgia strong consideration right now. Is that your sense of all this too?
Certainly, and good morning to everybody. Brandon, remember when we were little, we used to watch Sesame Street? I think it was Sesame Street. There was a word of the day. I think you've already used a great one in ancillary. I have a few more. I think the word symmetry, orchestration, and really kind of like investigation come to mind here with this Raiola visit. Here's what I mean by that. If you look, Brandon, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that feel orchestrated. There's this symmetry here with Raiola's visiting. Wow. But it's also during Georgia's spring practice when it's a day when they'll have some pads on, or you'll get to see a little bit more up close to the Georgia offense. Why is that important? Well, Georgia just turned over coordinators, and Georgia turned over to a coordinator that the Raiola family has a very good sense of connection to, and that would be Mike Bobo through Matthew Stafford. But here's the thing that's kind of working and building here, Brandon. Probably this is a bigger visit than, hey, I just want to try on some jerseys, get a photo shoot. More than he wants to see Georgia for the first time since October of 2021 when Georgia took down Kentucky. It's really about seeing what Georgia looks like, trying the Air Jordan Georgia's on, make sure they still fit, they still feel real nice. Seeing all the new tweaks, weight room, bones, the bells and whistles, the locker room, the Lamborghini seats, seeing the trophies that have been added to the trophy case, and there are a lot. Probably Georgia's added probably enough for a new big trophy case since Raiola visited in October of 2021. But here's the symmetry, Brandon. You've got top wide receivers galore. Here's a good example. Ryan Wingo out of Missouri. He is in town this weekend. I was like, hey, man, I was talking to him earlier this week. I said, hey, man, you picked a good weekend. He's like, that's when Raiola's going to be in town. He's like, oh, man, I know all about that. That's my guy. This is potential targets. This is trying on how Georgia looks. A big test drive, if you want to say, for Georgia and Raiola. And that's not the only. They got Jaden Riddell, who's the nation's number one tight end, according to On3.com. That's another young man out of Missouri. Eli Drinkwitz is probably not going to like this visit list this weekend in Georgia. But you got Nycard, you got Jacoby White. You've got a lot of potential targets and weapons there for Raiola to look around and those guys to start thinking, hey, man, how about Georgia? How does this feel? And the other thing, Brandon, it just kind of sets the stage for the big visits to come in June. Behind the scenes, you see that it's going to be another mega first weekend in June. I tell you, the Smart family will probably never have plans the first weekend in June because that's when they try to cram as many 5-stars into the House of Pain as possible. You hear rumblings in the background. Jeremiah Smith talking about he wants to come the first weekend in June. He wants to take all of his visits with Dylan Raiola. You hear Peyton Woodyard's going to be there, who lists Raiola as a potential roommate. It just keeps going on. Ellis Robinson, the number one cornerback in the country, the highest rated commitment in the class, is already supposed to be there. You already see some jockeying here for what June's going to look like.
Yeah, I want to get to that more in a moment. Let me focus in on Raiola in particular here. The sense that I get is that if you look at Nebraska, USC, I sort of put them in the same category, and I put Georgia in kind of a category by itself. Because on the one hand, when it comes to this recruitment, neither Nebraska nor USC can come close to matching Georgia's penchant for winning. But the one thing that Nebraska and USC can both offer Raiola that Georgia probably doesn't is, listen, Nebraska will build its entire program around Raiola. He'll be the most important recruit they've gotten in 100 years. So there's clearly a level of, I guess, prestige for Dylan being, that coveted by a program that just has not won these kinds of recruiting battles in a long, long time. In the case of USC, this is a very quarterback-friendly program. Now, listen, Georgia wants to be great at every position, but Georgia's also a program where every position matters. So to me, it sort of seems like, hey, do you want to come to a place where you're going to win and be around other great players, or you want to go to a program like Nebraska and USC where you may not win quite as much, but they're going to treat you as the most important thing in the world, and I guess it's a matter of which of those pitches makes the most sense to Raiola. Is that an assessment of this? Certainly,
Brandon. Let's think in the meme culture, the meme culture right now for this generation. You think of Raiola going to Nebraska, I think of that one with Will Smith and the closing credits of Bel Air. When he's looking around the living room and there's no furniture, there's nothing around, there's just emptiness. I think that's the Nebraska fit right for there with Raiola. I think with USC, you can insert any of those highlights or lowlights you want to call from their last bowl game where they got rocked and they looked pretty terrible doing it, trying to stop people on defense. The key here for Georgia, Brandon, is not just winning, because everybody's going to assume winning now for Georgia going forward. He would have had winning at Ohio State. I think development is the key factor there. It's like him looking around every day and knowing that those guys on the other side of the ball, there's probably 10 to 12 NFL first or second round draft picks on the other side of the ball. That's going to make him better. That's going to make the game easier. That's going to cultivate his skill set where, maybe the last year or so of his high school career, he hasn't really been developed the way the nation's number one quarterback in the country probably should be on an everyday setting. I think that's what's really important. The thing I get with Raiola in Georgia is if he doesn't go to Georgia, he realizes that he's going to have to face them to check off all of his college dreams in college football. Georgia will be standing in the way, looming like, a 10-foot titan. And I think that's something that Raiola is going to really consider as he goes through his measured pace right here and not going too fast with his next commitment and figure out, hey, wouldn't it just be better to be with those guys than to be against those guys in big playoff games?
So at the risk of coming across as negative, I guess I do have to ask, if Raiola takes his official visit to Georgia first weekend in June, then from a timeline standpoint, that kind of lines up pretty nicely with what Arch Manning did a year ago. That's a recruitment that I thought that Georgia was going to win, and ultimately it didn't. For Georgia fans who want to be hopeful that Raiola eventually lands at UGA, what makes the Dylan recruitment different from the Arch recruitment a year ago?
I got a good one, Brandon. It's a number 2, and that's not how many championships Georgia has won back-to-back. That's how many quarterbacks Georgia has signed in the last 3 cycles. That's a very paltry number considering where we're at with college football and the revolving door, or maybe we should say the express lane for 4 or 5-star high school quarterbacks. What does that mean? That means class separation. That means Georgia signed Brock Vandegrift in 2021, January. Georgia signed Gunnar Stockton in 2021. He also enrolled Vandegrift in January of 2022. There were no quarterbacks last year. There were no guys coming in grad transfer. There were no guys coming in through the portal. So that's pretty ideal class separation for when Raiola, who does expect to play and want to play when he gets to college. Maybe not so much that first season, but he wants to. You look at what Nebraska has. Like I said earlier, empty. He could come in and start day one likely at Nebraska. But when you think about USC, they just signed a top 15 overall prospect at corner in the last class in California, and Malachi Nelson. So I think, everybody wants a guy that can come in. I say I don't care about the depth chart. Everybody likes that Gunnar Stockton approach where he says, hey, man, I'm going to graduate from Georgia. I know that. I don't know how much I'll play, but I'm going to graduate from Georgia, and we'll see we'll throw a hat in the ring, and we'll give it our best shot, and we'll see how many plays he can make for the Dogs. I think with Georgia, there's a lot of things. It's a lot of things with Georgia, Brandon, where some people would think the strongest thing is winning in championships, where I don't know if that's exactly the strongest thing anymore. And I said this week on Hedges, Brandon, to think about. Georgia has reached the point where it doesn't need a quarterback to come on the field and help them beat a team they probably shouldn't have. Georgia is way past that point now where they need a quarterback to pull some Houdini acts out of his magic helmet and lead them back and maybe beat a team they shouldn't have. Now, if you bring everything that Georgia is now and what it will still be 2 years from now to the table with a quarterback that everybody says Pat Mahomes, he can reach any part of the field, he's got some mobility, he's got an NFL background with his father, it's going to be scary if Raiola comes to Georgia and pairs up with all the other pieces on the table.
Very, very interesting to think about. You also talked about the other guys, at least you mentioned this briefly, that are going to be here. Ryan Wingo, great receiver out of St. Louis is an example of this. Give me a little bit of the rest of the landscape here about what's been going on so far this week, but also more impressive guys who are taking a visit to Athens here this weekend.
Here's the thing, Brandon. The program almost sells itself right now. They bring these boys in to watch spring practice, and think about it now. It's the selling point is, hey, this is what recruits have told me. Hey, Georgia wanted me to come up and watch spring practice. And, man, I had to take advantage of that because I want to see how the best in the country does it. They want to see, and a lot of these kids see like 6 spring practices in a month. And when they see Georgia, they're going to see why Georgia wins. They're going to see how hard they're coached. They're going to hear Kirby Smart on the microphone where there will be no de-recruiting involved because they're going to see exactly what he's like with his team, with his national championship roster on a daily basis, on an every practice period basis. So they go and they compare, they contrast, and they see what Georgia has. And most, more likely than not, want to be a part of it. They want to get better. They want to be part of those guys in the lab that are brewing on the way to Sundays in the NFL.
Really, really interesting. Give us some more of these names. We see some of these on the screen here. When you got, I mentioned Ryan Wingo. You talking about Nye Carr, who we talked about earlier in the show. Scovey White back on campus here, there as well. Give us a little bit more insight into some of these names.
Here's a big one, Brandon. Number 66 overall defensive lineman, a set-the-edge, choose violence type of defensive end. I'm talking about Justin Green out of Mountain View High School in Lawrenceville. Brandon, I love this prospect for Georgia in the 2024 class because he's a guy that, get this, Brandon, love stories like this because it intersects on field and high school with college potential. But Justin, get this, he was a 2-time all-region player in a pretty stinking good region in Gwinnett County 7A football. And he decided that wasn't good enough. He decided he needed to get better, to make himself an even better player. He puts on like 35, 40 pounds, Brandon, kind of like C.J. Madden. In about 4 or 5 months, he retains his speed, and all of a sudden, he goes from a guy that could probably play, at a group of 5 level, somewhere maybe even reaching into the ACC a little bit, to he can play anywhere in the country, and that's Justin Green. Usually, last time I spoke with him, which was about a week and a half ago, Justin says he's really looking at 4 schools. He counts Duke among that number. He counts South Carolina among that number. He counts Auburn among that number. And he counts Georgia among that number. LSU is also in that mix there as well. But for him, he just looks at it, man, as like he's looking for places that can get him to the league, get him to his dreams. And he's going to take a couple of visits to Georgia, not just this one this weekend, a couple of visits over the next month or so to make sure he gets a good read and a good handle on Georgia. Georgia just offered him, Brandon, about 2 months ago after the national championship victory. So that's a situation where he hasn't been to Georgia as a recruit prior to this weekend. I think Amari Jefferson, Brandon, he's a guy that plays receiver. He's got Tennessee baseball commitment right now, but Georgia was one of the first to realize his worth as a receiver. He plays at the Baylor School in Chattanooga. That's where Will Muschamp's son plays. He's the quarterback there. Muschamp's son just recently committed to Vanderbilt. Yeah. Interesting to see that for that family. Another interesting family dynamic there with the Muschamps in the SEC. But you've got a guy that, Amari Jefferson, Brandon, looks like the type of guy that Georgia tries to sign in every class. Big, athletic receiver. It's going to be, Jaden Riddell, that's another guy. It's out of Missouri. This is probably the most interesting hometown. You probably want to see it in one of those places in The Last of Us where they stop in their cross-country tour. But his name of his town, Brandon, is called Peculiar, Missouri.
How about
I'm not making that up. Peculiar, Missouri. And he's rated as the number 1 tight end in the country by some services. Brandon, one of those things, you look at his film, what he's doing is he's lining up at the X position a lot, making a lot of plays downfield in a traditional receiver role. And then there are other plays where he's inside and he's going across the middle. I tell you, this young man has really good speed, 6'4", 230. We know what that model frame looks like for in Todd Hartley's room. That's kind of what Brock Bowers looked like when he came in. Not saying that Georgia's ever going to find another Brock Bowers, but that's the skill set. That's the body type they're looking for.
Really interesting. I want to finish up with this kind of away from recruiting a moment, but on Before the Hedges on Wednesday, you had a fascinating conversation with Nolan Smith. I believe we're going to get a part 2 of that coming up this upcoming Wednesday there as well. Nolan's one of these guys that at one point in time was a recruit we talked about on shows like this and shows like Before the Hedges, and now his Georgia career is completed, and I think he stands as one of the more intriguing and just respected guys to come through this program. Jeff, what was your key takeaway getting a chance to hear him kind of reflect back on his own career on Wednesday night? I thought it was great. I think our entire audience should really seek it out. Go find that. So many folks kind of already have. But a fun conversation with Nolan Smith. What did you enjoy about it?
A lot. Because you're going to talk about, when the 30 for 30s come out about these Georgia Bulldogs of the Kirby Smart era, I think a lot of probably one of the signature keynote interviews and sources that folks will rely on will be Nolan Smith because he was there. I can remember him telling me that he would come to Georgia if they got Justin Fields, because he always wanted to play with a mobile quarterback. And then you heard him go through so many timestamps. It felt like a Disney ride, man, where you're like, okay, Nolan's your tour guide through this era. What did he think about that? Brandon, he told me that he came pretty stinking close to trying to play in the Natty. He couldn't maybe put a suit on yet, but he could do some arm curls when the TCU game came around. And he was like talking back and forth with Kirby Smart, and he's like, hey, man, just let me dress. Maybe he was looking for one of those Richard LeCount moments in that Peach Bowl win where he played the last snap of the game as a very deep safety. But Nolan said, Kirby said, when they call for somebody that they need somebody, if you're in full dress, I know you're just going to run out there.
Yeah.
And he talked about that. He talked about the belief the team had in Stetson Bennett and why he won over the locker room. I think one of the probably most under-realized and not talked about under-the-radar moments of the 2021 championship season with Nolan was just a wrecking crew that day against Florida. He had the type of signature game that we wanted to see the nation's number one overall prospect have at Georgia. He was brilliant in that game. But afterward, he gave some of the most pointed, directed comments that if folks were listening closely, there was no conflict about, is it JT Daniels, is it Stetson? That was a very extreme vote of confidence, and I thought that was a big point in the 2021 season, both publicly because you got to see how the Dogs and a connected team leader, team anchor like Nolan was thinking internally about how they valued Stetson and what he could do for the Dogs. And you keep going through the list, man. I asked him, like, what was his signature memory as a Bulldog? I bet we could ask everybody on the DawgNation cruise, Brandon, what they thought Nolan Smith might have said there. He came up with the game prep and the energy at noon for taking on Arkansas back in 2021. A 12 o'clock kickoff, Brandon,
Yeah.
and everyone in DawgNation absolutely loathes those 12 o'clock kickoffs. For the players who got up at 6, who worked out, who ate breakfast together, they did their stretches and got on the bus, and they heard Stanford rocking and rolling at noon for a national matchup against Arkansas and their old friend Sam Pittman. For him to be the greatest moment, most emotional moment, best feeling game, most fun game of his Georgia career. I thought it was fascinating. You're right, my friend. We do have part 2 coming up on Before the Hedges next Wednesday at 8 p.m.
Jeff, it was great stuff. Good information on Dylan Raiola and the other visitors here this weekend. Fun time to be a Dog fan. You love this time of year for sports, and for us, the recruiting groundwork being laid right now is a part of all of that action. So we'll look forward to reading more from you at DawgNation.com, watching you every Wednesday on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger, and, of course, seeing you back here on DawgNation Daily at this same time next Friday there as well. Have a great weekend.
Hey, man, hope everybody's brackets get better today. Take it easy, man.
See you. That's not the right music. There we go. There we go.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Interesting from Jeff there as it relates to Nolan Smith. First of all, 2 quick things. I think when Nolan stepped up and defended Stetson Bennett after it was not a great game for Bennett against Florida in 2021, that was an incredibly valuable moment because it wasn't just, hey, one teammate sticking up for another. What it really was a bold prediction that turned out to be true. And that's the thing you got to keep in mind here is that leadership requires credibility. And you can't just be out there saying a bunch of stuff, have it proved wrong. Well, all of a sudden, you're not quite as much of a leader at that point as you used to be because people aren't quite so sure they want to follow you anymore. You've heard me say this before, that the way to be a leader is to have followers. You can't be a true leader if you don't have people willing to follow you. And the way in which you cultivate followers as a, aspiring leader is to make predictions that turn out to be true, to be able to see not the distant future, not obviously, nobody's got a crystal ball, but to be able to kind of recognize what's about to happen. In the case of Stetson Bennett, Nolan Smith recognized that, hey, Georgia was going to be in good hands with Bennett as the quarterback. He went on to lead him to a national championship and led him to another national championship. That's what makes the words that Nolan used after the Florida game in 2021 so forceful, is because the prediction in so many words that Nolan made that day turned out to be true. The other thing that Jeff says there, and let me just give you a different way of looking at things for a moment. There are a lot of Georgia fans, and on the one hand, this is rightly so, who say, man, Georgia has played a miserable slate of home games over the course of the last few years, and what's going to happen here in 2023 is probably the worst of the bunch. Now, in the future, this is going to change because of the change in SEC scheduling, the fact that Georgia's got some pretty aggressive non-conference scheduling about to come home to roost here. But the last few years, there's been this thought, looking ahead to this year too, of, gosh, man, this home slate is just, not all that great. But another way of looking at this is, in this sort of period of time in which a lot of folks would say, hey, Georgia's played a pretty lackluster, collection of home games. Last year, you may have had the biggest game in the history of Sanford Stadium with number 1 Tennessee coming in, and getting ran out of the stadium by Georgia. We know the atmosphere that game had. That may have been the biggest moment in the history of the ballpark, between the edges, dating back to, 1929 or whenever the stadium began. And then as Jeff points out, and I believe rightly so, that Georgia-Arkansas game in 2021 was special. It's probably the loudest noon crowd of all time. And I don't say that lightly, but it probably was. It was a night game atmosphere for a game that kicked off at noon, and it was pretty special. And don't forget, ESPN Game Day was there for that, and they were also back for the following home game against Kentucky as well. That in a stretch of time where most Georgia fans would say, gosh, the home slate's been pretty miserable, in that stretch of time, you have a situation in 2021 when you had back-to-back home games that were featured on ESPN's College Game Day, and last year you may have had the biggest game in the history of your stadium. So it's at least another consideration for what's been a pretty popular narrative. I certainly understand why Georgia fans haven't loved the home slate, but I think it's also appropriate to say, actually, some of these home games have given you maybe more than you realize the last couple of seasons as well. Speaking of always giving you more than you realize, that's what our friends at Royal Caribbean are famous for. Royal Caribbean Cruise Vacations, you know how much we love those. In fact, I love seeing how much some of you love those. More of that on our Golden Shoe to close out today's show. But if you've heard me talk about it and you want to experience it for yourself, this is the time to start booking that Royal Caribbean Cruise Vacation. Springtime travel, you think about maybe spring break, something like that, time to get on that if you want to do that. Summertime, really, this is the showtime, go time to get ready for all of that. Or you start thinking about January 2024, the debut of Icon of the Seas, the brand new cruise ship from Royal Caribbean that's going to have the largest water park at sea. It's going to have really the best of all kinds of vacations, beach vacation, wonderful resort, all of that kind of housed right there on the brand new cruise ship, brand new class of cruise ships being introduced. The first one of those being Icon of the Seas. A great travel agent makes a great cruise vacation even better. Our travel agent that we trust is Jessica Slater. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. So many of you have met her, gotten to know her. You have questions about Royal Caribbean cruises, she can tell you everything you need to know because she's been on even more of them than I have been. So you can check out Jessica on all of that. Of course, we'll see you on the DawgNation cruise coming up April 24th through the 28th. Man, it's going to be a lot of fun. Can't wait for all that. So many of you booked up, ready to go, and really almost the entirety of the DawgNation team going to be on hand for that there as well. So that is going to be a great time. All right, let's transition here now and go cruising around the SEC coming up on Royal Caribbean. On Monday's show, I'm going to spend a little bit of time, this is coming up this upcoming Monday, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the hype that's already building for the Georgia-Tennessee game. I think this is kind of interesting, and I think it gives you a little bit of a way to kind of frame the spring for Georgia. Hey, what you want to see, building blocks towards getting ready for the upcoming season for Georgia and for the game. And a lot of folks say matters most in the regular season for UGA right now against Tennessee. We'll do some of that then. But along those lines, ESPN has also got what they're calling their season-defining games for their way to early top 25 teams. And I'm going to save the Georgia part of this for Monday, but I did notice that it's interesting that for both Georgia and Alabama, Tennessee is kind of mentioned as that season-defining game. In the case of Georgia, it's because it's really it's the only game on Georgia's schedule they have less than like an 88 or 90% chance of winning. It's literally probably the only shot Georgia has to be tested maybe at all. College football has a way of surprising you. Maybe this season will, but on paper right now, the projection is Tennessee the only game that could even be close. So that's why it gets mentioned for Georgia. In the case of Alabama, it's also related to the fact that Tennessee beat Alabama a year ago. And you may have heard Vols fans talking about that. They wrote books about it. They made VHS cassette tapes to sell about this. They are clearly very proud of that victory against Alabama. And obviously, as that rivalry shifts back to Tuscaloosa this year, it'll be a chance at revenge for the Crimson Tide. But to be as objective as I'm capable of being here for a moment, if you want an example of what Tennessee has been able to do through 2 years of Josh Heupel, this might be it. ESPN taking a survey of the SEC here saying for both Alabama and Georgia, Tennessee stands as the biggest game. And we're not Tennessee fans, but wouldn't you agree that's kind of true? I mean, listen, Georgia's biggest rivalry game will take place against Florida. That's always true. But the biggest game Georgia's likely to play here this season is on the road at Tennessee. Georgia fans would probably say that. Alabama fans would probably also say, yeah, man, we're licking our chops. We want a taste of the Vols. Maybe they feel the same way with LSU too, because LSU also beat them. But something about the nature of that game a year ago, you got to think that probably gets the Alabama fan blood boiling a little bit. So I think that Tennessee is probably still a long way away towards being truly competitive for, an SEC championship spot, an actual playoff spot. I think they're probably a ways away from getting there, and they may never get there. But if you want proof that Tennessee as a program has really grown in stature, I think you look at the fact that it now counts as a big game for Georgia. That's something that has not been true for quite some time. It counts as a big game for Alabama right now. Alabama fans are once again calling third Saturday in October a rivalry, something they would not have done for quite some time. So if you want to see evidence of program growth for Tennessee, that's some of where you see it. They are not necessarily good enough yet to actually be good, to be a championship contender, but they're good enough to get other teams' attention. You got to give them, I guess, at least a little bit of credit for that. The other thing that kind of pops out to me looking at this list of most significant games, or what was the phrase they used? Season-defining games. I think it once again kind of points to a little bit of the mystery as it relates to LSU. LSU is one of those teams that preseason number 8 in the way too early top 25 for ESPN. But seemingly right now, and when it comes to the national chatter, getting nowhere near as much love as Alabama's getting, despite the fact that LSU beat Alabama a year ago. And obviously it's probably not a surprise that ESPN mentions the Alabama game as that season definer for LSU. But let's park on that for a moment. What would it mean for Brian Kelly to beat Nick Saban Alabama 2 years in a row? I mean, that would, I think, signify a real changing landscape in the SEC. Not just the demise of Alabama. Eventually that's going to happen. Maybe 2023 is the year that takes place. It's not just potentially the demise of Alabama, but it's also the resurrection of Brian Kelly at LSU, because that's the standard here. LSU head coaches are expected to win national championships very, very quickly. That's what Ed Orgeron did. That's what Les Miles did before that. That's what Nick Saban did before that. That the standard at LSU is a national championship, and for new coaches at LSU, those championships typically come quickly. It's Brian Kelly showing his ability to kind of travel a similar path. We think of the SEC, even in a 14 playoff world, it's kind of a two-bid league. They have proven the capability of getting 2 teams in the playoff, but in the past, that's been Georgia and Alabama. Could LSU try to join Georgia as the 2 playoff teams from the SEC this year? That's what Kelly gets a chance to play for there against Alabama here later on this season. And, you look at the way in which LSU kind of looms on other schedules there as well. For Florida and Billy Napier, who's trying to do something year 2. For Ole Miss, who's also in this ESPN way too early top 25. How good LSU is also going to go a long way towards determining Hugh Freeze, first season at Auburn. I'll put that in that same category. How good LSU is and how much of a true, legitimate playoff contender they're capable of being in year 2 of Brian Kelly going to go a long way towards determining exactly what the outlook is for some other teams in the SEC that have a chance to play them here this year. So some of that early buzz starting to build for some of those big football games later on this fall. On another sporting front for a moment, how about quick roundup of the NCAA tournament from yesterday? Probably should not be surprised that Virginia once again suffered an embarrassing upset at the hands of Furman. Congratulations to the Paladins there on that. Maryland-West Virginia was a really fun 8-9 game. Maryland moves on there. Missouri, an example of one of those SEC teams that I thought played pretty well. Missouri was, in some of the – I've joked before, I watch about 5 minutes of college basketball a night, and from that, I've made very, very strong opinions about this tournament. When I would watch Missouri, they were always pretty good, so maybe it wouldn't be so surprising if they make a run. Alabama, I guess, no real problem with Corpus Christi yesterday there on that. Auburn advances. Tennessee does get their round 2 matchup with Duke. We talked about that in terms of, for a Tennessee athletic program that's been ranked number 1 in football, they were ranked number 1 in baseball. They've been near the top of the rankings in basketball. Actually having something to show for some of this in the postseason, about time to do that, there is zero reason why Tennessee couldn't or maybe even shouldn't beat Duke. This is a first-year coach in John Shire. This is a Duke team that's only recently started to play well. If you're Tennessee and you really take yourself seriously, this is a game this weekend they ought to win it. This may be actually among the more fun games of the weekend. We'll keep our eye on Saturday for Tennessee and Duke there. I think that should be a lot of fun. As far as SEC action today, you, of course, got Kentucky going against Providence. That'll get a lot of attention around here. And then, just kind of set yourself up for that final day of round one. I think FAU-Memphis is another one of those 8-9 games that could be fun. And Penny Hardaway and Memphis, I mean, listen, I'd really give either one of those teams a chance to beat Purdue in the second round, but certainly Memphis would be kind of an interesting clash of styles if that's the case. And plus, for Purdue, who's really, really big, Memphis does have some of that kind of size that can kind of match up there a little bit. I know that Kent State, Indiana is one of those. If you're looking kind of like a darling upset type team, the Golden Flashes out of the MAC have been one of those teams there on that. So I love the tournament. We don't talk a ton of college basketball around here because obviously you want to hear about football, but it's fun to have the tournament upon us, and we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. By the way, speaking of tournament action, best of luck today to the Lady Dogs as they take on Florida State. Are they the Lady Seminoles? I don't know. Are they Lady Noles? I don't know if that's the case or not. But either way, it's Georgia-Florida State women's basketball tournament this afternoon. We certainly be rooting hard for the Lady Dogs here today against Florida State there on that. It's also a busy sports weekend for Georgia there as well. Diamond Dogs begin SEC play at home this weekend against South Carolina. I think that Georgia's been one of the pleasant non-conference surprises from the SEC thus far this baseball season. They are clearly swinging the bats well, and I think that Jaden Woods probably gives them a pretty good presence on the mound as a Friday starter, I think. So it could be a fun season, and obviously getting off to a good start in SEC play would be great. Weather cooperating today would also be great, but that might not happen. For those of you who have your own youth league baseball and things like that going on, softball, I'm sure you're paying close attention to all that too. So if they can get some games in, best of luck to the Diamond Dogs, and of course for the Lady Dogs in the NCAA tournament, we send them best wishes as well. Love sports weekends around here. In fact, we love weekends of any type around here, and we always love a big finish to close out our week to get you ready for that weekend. Of course, we're thinking big finish. We're thinking about the Finish Long Drink, and I saw this tweet from the Finish Long Drink official account. You got to think it's fun to work at a place like this. Out there on their social media, they said, in case you're wondering what happens during our annual national sales meeting, so they've stacked up just rows and rows and rows of these long drink cans. I see the cranberry. I see the zero. I'm also colorblind. Maybe all the varieties are there. But you see a nice little stack of cans there, courtesy of the Finish Long Drink. Maybe you could build yourself one of those towers yourself here. Almost looks like a Christmas tree. Maybe you could get going on that yourself here this weekend. Of course, the Finish Long Drink presents the big finish to us here each and every Friday. And if you want to enjoy the Finish Long Drink and find out why so many folks are kind of buzzing about it, well, this is a great time to do that by going to thelongdrink.com. You can hear about the story. This is something that started in Helsinki back in the 1950s when the Summer Games were there. There are a lot of celebrity types that have kind of bought into the ownership here. You've heard us talk about some of that kind of stuff before, but it's a really cool, relatively new category of drink. It's a ready-to-drink cocktail, meaning it comes in a can, but it's not a beer. It kind of looks like one, but it's not. It's a ready-to-drink cocktail right through the can. You can pop the top and enjoy it. You can pour it in a glass and drink it like a mixed drink. Long drink cranberry, long drink strong, long drink zero. That's no carbs, no sugar. Long drink traditional in the blue can. Got the grapefruit flavor with the gin kick. A really, really fun thing to enjoy this weekend. Check out thelongdrink.com, and you can try some today. All right. A lot of you know that I am a fan of Royal Caribbean Cruise Vacations, and a lot of you also know there as well that, hey, listen, a lot of the audience has kind of taken my lead on this, and they've been taking their own Royal Caribbean Cruise Vacations as of late. Now, listen, I am certainly thankful to have so many of you supporting a great sponsor of ours. I really, really appreciate that, but I'm also glad to just see people having a good time because life, you want to have as much fun as you possibly can on this brief period of time we get to stand here on this planet. So with that in mind, I love to see our buddy Matt Rukavina. If you watch video regularly, you hear me read Matt's comments from time to time. How about Matt there? First of all, he put the Twitter poll out the other day about which shirt he'd wear on the cruise ship. He's got his National Champs World Tour t-shirt on, got the beverage in hand, saying not a bad way to ring in the big 4-0, some sun, a little champagne, and a national championship shirt on your back. He says the family took this photo. They were Tennessee fans, but they were good sports about the whole thing. He's hashtag golden shoe, hashtag national championship, hashtag go dogs. Matt Rukavina, that is great to see. Glad to see you having a great time on a cruise ship. Boy, look at that blue water. Look at that sunshine. Makes me wish I was there right now. So golden shoe indeed for you on that. Happy 40th birthday there as well. And our Gator Hater Countdown. 225 days from right now. Georgia back in Jacksonville, where the sun may be shining too, but not on the Florida sideline. They got nothing but misery coming their way. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. We'll see you back here Monday. DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to talking to you then. And on video. Time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They will show up on time, do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that. Glad to have you here on a rainy Friday as we take some of your comments here and just kind of find out what's on your mind here moving into a weekend. Let's see what else. Pete Williams enjoying that picture from Matt Rugavina. It was an awesome picture. It was. Craig Wasik also pointing out something very important. He said, we got to wish Kennesaw State luck today against Xavier in their first time being in the tournament. Totally. I think we've sort of adopted Kennesaw State as our team in the NCAA tournament. So, indeed, that's the case. Craig, glad to have you mention that. We'll definitely be rooting for the Owls today. For sure. Let's see. What else? What else is going on here? Miriam Corbin, Barry Tenahan celebrating a little St. Patrick's Day in here, which you'd love to be able to see. That's good stuff. Let's see what else. Nick Huntley checking in. Good to have him here there as well. Alan Verbanchik, James Crump also discussing the quarterback situation here. Steve Rogers says tomorrow's National Hangover Day, so there you go there on that. Let's see. I'm trying to find a Facebook comment I can read. Let's see what else is going on. Miriam Corbin, the subject of Brian McClendon as Georgia wide receivers coach. Yeah, I've been really happy with him thus far. I had a great conversation with him out in L.A. What a great personality he has. Great personality. It seems like he's making a big impact for this team here at the moment there as well. Let's see what else. Craig Jones bringing this up, and I mentioned this yesterday, so I mentioned this again. So Craig says, I've been on a cruise. First of all, we like that. And he says, what's up with the claim about recruiting violations that popped up a couple days ago? No meat to the article. Sure, this was previously addressed. So, yeah, there was this thing that popped up on Twitter from a guy named Jason McIntyre. Jason was the founder of a blog site called The Big League. Years ago, used to have some, kind of influence. I think since it's been bought by one of these national, deals, it's just as irrelevant as the rest of that national publication is. But at one point in time, it kind of, had a little bit of, cachet. Back in kind of the pre-social media age, the blogosphere was sort of the place where a lot of the, the best hot takes were kind of coming from. And Jason was kind of, at the forefront of that. He's also the guy, if you ever watch Colin Cowherd's TV show, Jason's the guy that now sits at the news desk with Colin, so that's who Jason McIntyre is. And so he put out on Twitter the other day, kind of out of nowhere, because Jason's not typically the guy that breaks college football news. Hearing that Georgia's worried about NCAA stuff. There is not a single person with actual college football credit, and I don't hate Jason McIntyre. I mean, I read the Big League for many, many years, so I don't hate him. But there's not really anybody with any kind of like college football credibility talking about this at all. So we're left to conclude this is just not a real thing. It's just not been picked up anywhere else. And it's not even of the level of the kind of thing that I would mention on what I kind of think of as the main show. This is the cool down. This is the time in which we can be a little bit more casual with our conversation. The main show ends when the fight song plays. So we're kind of in sort of like the wrap-up part. This is sort of the post-game show to the show itself. And so from that standpoint, we'll talk about it a little bit candidly here that I just don't think it rises to the level of being actual news because, as you said, there's very little substance to kind of back this up. And, as I said yesterday, if one of like the main serious national reporters who's kind of in the college football world all the time, if he were to write something like this, well, then you'd take that seriously at that point in time. But, this being someone kind of outside the typical sphere of college football news, you probably don't take it quite as seriously. The same thing kind of popped up a couple of years ago when Dan Patrick said something kind of similar, and it just sort of turned out to be, a big nothing. And if I had to predict, my guess is this is sort of a big nothing there as well, because there just doesn't seem to be any there, if you know what I'm saying. Let's see what else. Miriam Corbin, very funny. Miriam also asking about the G-Day plans there as well. So hopefully on Monday, I'm going to have another meeting and try to get some of that kind of squared away, for sure. Jamie Huff wants Georgia to have a real quarterback competition. Everything I gather is that it is going to be a real quarterback competition. Now, Jamie, there's also some truth to the fact that, hey, in the midst of a real quarterback competition, it might play out as most people predict. But if that be the case, that does not necessarily mean that it wasn't a real competition. Sometimes real competitions just have predictable conclusions. Paul Moon says he's not going to be able to be at G-Day in person, but glad it's going to be on TV. I'm sure a lot of folks feel the same way. Taylor Russell says that Kirby should be able to hold down the fort until Nolan Smith takes over as head coach. Yeah, that was some good stuff this week. Kenneth Holt on the subject of like the Tennessee violations sort of being the last NCAA story that we've kind of seen. I almost kind of wonder if that's also the last NCAA story we'll ever see, because I haven't really followed all this too very closely, but it seems like the FBI investigation of the college basketball teams, which was always like sort of weirdly intense to me for something that didn't seem to be all that critical. It seems like some of that's kind of fizzling here right now. I think we're about done with the idea of NCAA as an investigative body. Now, I believe that some of what you've heard from them lately about kind of trying to turn some of this up, and there was even some chatter the other day about how they might start going after teams for NIL violations on the basis of like circumstantial evidence. I think most of that is just a death rattle. I don't think the NCAA, for all intents and purposes, even really exists anymore. So I think we're probably about done with the idea of NCAA investigations. And you say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that college sports is just going to be, lawless? I think the SEC does a pretty good job of policing its own program's actions in terms of, this thought of, hey, don't do anything that makes us look bad. Sometimes that kind of shame thing does a pretty good job of kind of keeping people in line. You say, well, what about Chris Beard being hired as Ole Miss basketball coach? And what about this? What about that? I guess I'm a little bit of an outlier on some of this. My belief would be that a program like Ole Miss, because they know they're going to be scrutinized internally by the SEC folks, university president, things like that. My guess is they didn't just, hire Chris Beard because they'd seen his name on TV before. They must have done some sort of due diligence on that, I'm guessing. I'm willing to sort of give them the benefit of the doubt. Same thing with Brandon Miller playing for Alabama right now. I've told you that this is about as close as you can come to being too involved in a nasty situation and keeping on playing basketball, but Miller also has some legal rights there as well. I am very slow to be scandalized by a lot of this kind of stuff. And that's not to say that, there aren't some things that could scandalize me, but I feel like that there's just way too much performative outrage sometimes. And I think we try not to participate in that if we possibly can. But my assumption is that the people that run Ole Miss are not idiots. They hired Chris Beard as basketball coach. They probably looked into the situation that caused him to lose his job at Texas. And my assumption is that, even if Alabama's thirsty for a championship in basketball, they are also incentivized not to do something that's going to make them look, horrendous later on if more information comes out. But, maybe that just makes me an outlier. Let's see what else. Cigars and Bourbon says the NCAA has a new president. Things are going to change. The program wants the NCAA involved. It takes up too much time policing your own program. Yeah, obviously the NCAA has served a purpose, in the past, but I sort of think this newest NCAA president may be the last NCAA president. If I had to predict, that's my prediction. James Richards says if Raiola comes to Georgia, our receiver recruiting is going to go to another level, and that's the easiest thing to assume, isn't it, James? Is that quarterback brings those coattails with him, and guys like Jeremiah Smith or those guys get way more interested in Georgia because of the presence of that great quarterback. Jonathan Aaron says, what do you think about Stetson Bennett in San Francisco? Look at what Kyle Shanahan did with Brock Purdy. Jimmy G's gone. In their last game, they didn't have a quarterback at all because everyone was hurt. I don't mind it. I'll tell you this. My feelings about Kyle Shanahan are very, very weird. from the standpoint that I don't think anyone's ever hurt Atlanta sports over a brief period of time more than Shanahan did when he didn't run the football late in the Super Bowl. It's one of the biggest bonehead blunders that any coach has ever made. And yet, simultaneous to thinking that, I also think that if I was an offensive player of any stripe, quarterback, tight end, running back, Deebo Samuel style wide receiver, there's really no better coach, I believe, you could play for to get the most out of your skill set than Kyle Shanahan. I'll never understand why a coach that I generally believe is about the smartest that exists out there made such a dumb decision at the end of the Super Bowl a few years ago to not run the football and put that game on ice. But, I mean, I'm sure Charlie Warner has enjoyed his time in San Francisco. I would say that any Georgia offensive player that gets drafted by Kyle Shanahan in San Francisco is probably in a pretty good position to succeed. Thomas Dew also asking about Stetson getting drafted by the Ravens. Obviously, the connection to Todd Monken. As I've, I guess, half kiddingly, half seriously said before, I'm not quite so sure the relationship between Monken and Bennett was rosy enough to think that Monken's going to fall all over himself to try to get Stet in Baltimore. Also, let's also be fair to point out here that offensive coordinators in the NFL do not get a great say in personnel decisions either. Let's also keep that in mind too. Let's see what else. Jay Shipe's always in here trying to stir up trouble. Foster Moss also mentioning Stat with the Chiefs. Yeah, I guess they're in the market for a backup quarterback. For sure. Let's see what else. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a minute. We'll take another trip around the comment section. Tom N says, does Georgia sell strips of grass from Dooley Field? Could be a cool way to raise money. Yeah, I guess it could be. Have they ever done that before? Maybe when they I guess the problem with selling the grass is eventually it kind of dries up. That may be part of the issue there with that. A little bit easier to sell like a piece of a basketball floor because it obviously is going to stay in the same condition that it's in. But yeah, anything like that would be kind of fun. Johnny Surf Dog enjoyed the next generation look at Raylan Wilson. I do like him a lot. Scott Harris said talk to Jessica Slater yesterday. First of all, Scott, that's awesome. Yeah, we're excited about a great group of folks for the cruise, and it sounds like Scott's going to be on the ship a couple of weeks prior to that, so that's awesome, Scott. Hope you enjoy yourself. That's great. Randy Hall talking about our commenter buddy Matt Rugavina living the life of the rich and famous. It certainly seems that. Boy, he's always enjoying himself, which is great to see. I live vicariously through some of y'all because I'm pretty much always hearing this. Johnny Surf Dog also looking forward to seeing Branson Robinson on G-Day, which is great. I'm excited about that there as well. James Lawson says it definitely feels weird admitting that Tennessee was the biggest game of the season in recent memory. He says a number one versus number one is incredibly rare. If it had been Bama, the college football world would have come to a stop. Yeah, that's the case. I mean, I can tell you from a business standpoint, the energy around that Georgia-Tennessee game was pretty off the charts. It's almost like you don't want to call it too big of a game because you feel like you're giving Tennessee more credit you want to give them. But there is no doubt that Georgia fans were in a mood that week. They had heard some stuff about the team they didn't like. There was this thought that, anytime a team tries to inflate itself really quickly, that's always has the feeling of a little bit of an insult for a team like Georgia that had worked its way to get the national championship. And Tennessee thought after 1 year on the job, they were going to make it look easy under Josh Heupel. But, y'all, college football is not easy. It is not easy. A program like Georgia makes it look easier oftentimes than it is, but the sport overall is just not easy. And so I think the thought is, oh, man, Tennessee's just going to take Georgia's lunch money. They're going to, they beat Alabama, and now they're going to come in here and beat Georgia. Man, Georgia fans were in a mood that week. I'd never seen Sanford Stadium like that. I'd seen Sanford Stadium loud and cheering for their team. This wasn't that. I mean, they were cheering for Georgia, but those fans were there to be a nemesis against the Vols as much as they were there for anything. And it was impactful. You could feel it. There was this – I think about this sometimes. Some of that stuff late in the game when the crowd got loud – and then it got louder, and then it got louder again. It's almost like, Did you ever grow up with some of those like VHS tapes of like some of the NBA things? There was always this thing, I think it was Isaiah Thomas, talking about Tom Chambers. Remember Tom Chambers, about some great dunk that he had where Isaiah's like, he jumped and then he jumped again, basically talking about how he like, elevated again seemingly after he was already in the air. That's to me what this crowd sort of sounded like a little bit. It was, big third and fourth down plays where it would go to a crescendo and then it would go up again and like just sort of keep climbing that level, that level to the point where, my ears were ringing like it was a rock concert. I mean, it was really, really, really something. It was, and I'll always remember it. Paul Smith taking a look at some of those photos we've posted from Georgia practice yesterday saying we've got some real athletes on our team. Yeah, Paul, that's the easiest thing to notice, isn't it? Just the overall physical specs of these Georgia players. They certainly looked the part. There is no doubt about that. Let's see what else. Senior Dog 54 says, I saw Bowie play in high school several times. Very gifted athlete. He says needs to keep it between the ditches. Yeah, I mean, obviously, listen, college is about a time for like growing and developing, and that's what Georgia gives him a chance to do. Better culture here, almost certainly than existed at Texas A&M, and it sounds like Deion Bowie's got a chance to be a big part of this. Let's see what else. Randy Hall on the subject of do it for Dev. Yeah, we love that as an idea for Georgia here this year. No doubt about that. Scott Harris says outside linebacker, my biggest concern. I could see it being a concern because obviously Georgia was a little bit thin at that spot last year. But listen, while I understand why you might consider it a concern, I also believe there's a real chance that as you get into the season, that could become one of the most fun position groups in this team. Y'all, I think that Marvin Jones Jr., I don't think you saw the best of Marvin last year because I think he was pretty hurt for a good while last year. He is taking that time right now, not participating in spring practice. He's going to be healthy, and I think he may be very, very good. And this crop of freshmen they brought in, Gabe Harris and Damon Wilson, Sam Mpemba, you may hear from them sooner rather than later. And a guy like Darius Smith is a guy we've been talking about for a while. I think he could be really fun. I do. I think he could be really fun. James Lawson said, I've never screamed that much before a game. Talking about the Tennessee game, he says you could barely keep up with each play. As soon as it was over, you had to make noise again. I noticed that too, James, where because of the fact that Tennessee wants to play fast, that, normally, this is a dumb thing to say, but when you're making a bunch of noise in the game, that takes a lot of air out of you. And so, when the play's over, you typically have to kind of like catch your breath again so you can go out and scream some more. But when Tennessee's playing so fast, you're having to get up and then get up and then get up. And at first I was like, is Tennessee going to go so fast that they maybe keep this crowd out of the game because the crowd's always trying to catch its breath? Well, what happened is when Georgia would get a stop, I'm talking about like a deflected pass, when Georgia would create any kind of incompletion in that game, that created that little bit of break that the fans needed to get loud again. And it's just kind of funny how that up-tempo offense, when it's working, it compounds on itself. But when there's an incompletion, when there's any kind of stoppage in play, all of a sudden the defense gets a chance to take advantage of some of that compounding interest. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting chess match, about how the Georgia defense was matching up against the very, very fast, in terms of the speed with which it wants to play, Tennessee offense. Gary Holtz checking out. Gary, appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that. Keith Finley with a prediction that Christian Miller could break through this year. That's great to see. I'll give Christian Miller a shout out because about a month or so ago, I was sick. I wasn't able to go. I don't ever get sick, but I happened to be sick at this particular time. My family, wife, 2 kids, went to the Gym Dogs meet, and afterwards they went to a local restaurant. Christian Miller, Ernest Green, a couple Georgia players were there, and they're super nice to my kids. Super nice to my kids. It's amazing how a lot of these Georgia guys, because when it comes to like a lot of Georgia stuff, especially football games, I'm working, so when my family goes, they're not around me. And so they'll kind of, bump into some players sometimes. I tell you, these Georgia players have always been really nice to my kids, and I really appreciate that, including Christian Miller the other day, which was really, really cool. Let's see what else. Yeah, Dog fans were roaring in the rain that day. Craig Jones is right about that. Let's see what else. Miriam Corbin said she screamed the entire game. She took out her frustrations with them. I like that. Sam Burke says an NFL friend of mine who worked the combine said the UGA players as a whole are just bigger, stronger, and faster than all the other NCAA players. Sam, you love that, and that's also probably why guys like if you're a Matt Landers or a Amir Speed, guys like that. Well, of course, you want to come back to a place like Georgia because of the kind of talent that exists at UGA. That's going to draw a bunch of NFL scouts. So if you want more eyeballs on your own NFL future, why not hang around a bunch of guys like that? I saw where in the future, and you can insert your own joke here. In the future, the Big 12 apparently is going to do a league-wide combine, putting the entire league into sort of one pro day type situation. I think it kind of gives you an idea of just how sparse the overall NFL talent is in the Big 12 right now. Whereas the place like Georgia, as Eagles GM Howie Roseman said a year ago, kind of a one-stop shop for the players that you want to have in your NFL franchise, for sure. Barry Watkins says, my wife says, help, I see a spider. He says, not now, DawgNation's on. That's really funny, Barry. That's really funny. All right, final comments. We got to go. Let's see what else. Back over here on YouTube for a moment. Cigars and Bourbon, we're glad to have you here, both watching the show but also participating in the comment section there as well. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Jonathan Aaron says over-under on one game mustard and golf balls be thrown in the field this year. Yeah, that's pretty funny, Jonathan. Pretty funny. Let's see what else. Paul Moon, the idea of the track guys not being able to hold up as well in the football field. I mean, there's always going to be an issue with that. I mean, the thing that makes you really, really fast, typically speaking, is a pretty, lighter frame. I mean, that's just, y'all don't need me to tell you that. And there's obviously no free lunch in football. You get smaller, you get faster, but you also become more prone to getting a little bit banged up. There are the rare exceptions where like really big guys also run really fast, but that's, typically speaking, a pretty big outlier. I think it's important to have kind of a mixture of those guys in your program. You can't be all one thing. And I think that maybe at one point Georgia on offense had kind of gotten a little too much into, skill players who were maybe not as fast for their position. They were far more durable, but they were not as fast for their position. And so I kind of like the mixture, I think, that Georgia's trying to put together right now. I think that's good. They've clearly kind of, I think, emphasized speed with some of their recent recruiting efforts, which is probably pretty good. DMart42, speaking of speedy guys, thinks that Arian Smith's a really underrated player. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the most likely outcome for Smith's career is, but the ceiling, like math people kind of talk about like Bayes' theorem stuff. If you look at the Bayes' theorem for Arian Smith's career, there is a percentage chance that he's great, that he actually becomes a great player, because you saw the Ohio State game. He can literally run past to defensive backs, and that's obviously a very valuable skill to have for a wide receiver. So there is at least a percentage chance that Arian Smith is a great, potentially unstoppable force. The most likely outcome is probably something less than that, of course. But pretty clearly, on a per-catch basis, there are a few guys who've been more impactful per catch than Smith has been. But the challenge for Georgia and the challenge for Smith himself through his own health and things like that is just finding a way to get more of those catches. But on a per-catch basis, I don't know that anybody's been more impactful than what Arian's ever been. Scott Harris on the subject of Aaron Rodgers on Carson Beck. I believe that's a fake quote. We are in fake quote season. And the fake quote stuff exists as a way of kind of mocking the media. I think that's the purpose of the fake quotes. So you got to be really, really mindful of like fake quote season. But I think there is an Aaron Rodgers thing on the internet talking about Carson Beck, but that's not real. A-Rod was on McAfee like 3 days ago. So if Aaron Rodgers had really said something about Carson Beck, we would have already done 45 minutes of that on the show probably. But be careful about fake quote season, because we are definitely – college football off-season time is fake quote season. We are definitely there, y'all. We are definitely there. Let's see what else. James Lawson on the subject of what Javon Bullard and Cedric Von Prawn said about representing the G. Yeah, I loved it. We're going to do that on Monday's show. I thought that was really good. Really good. I didn't quite have time to get it in the show today, but I thought it was really good. William Camacho talking about the Falcons drafting Nolan Smith. I'd love it. I'd love to see Nolan here. I would. I'd love to see Nolan here, for sure. I'd love that. All right, let us go for now. Good stuff. Appreciate you being here. Hope y'all have a great weekend. Y'all check out the Atlanta Journal-Constitution online, ajc.com. You want coverage of the Kennesaw State Owls as they begin their run through the NCAA tournament. What we hope is a run for them through the NCAA tournament. You can check that out online, ajc.com. You want more on the Falcons draft prospects, as someone was mentioned a moment ago, you can get that there as well. All of that there. So plenty of stuff on Kennesaw State here today. That's good stuff. Also, I thought this was interesting, and this is real news. So we've talked a little bit about sports betting in Georgia. Some people are in favor of it. Some people might not be, but it's a thing that's been happening. And at one point in time, it seemed like this run for sports betting was more real than it's ever been before. And then it kind of fizzled in the legislature. You have that crossover day, and like a lot of those sports betting bills just died. But now it's kind of back on the table again. You can read about this at ajc.com. It sounds like the Lieutenant Governor, Burt Jones, is pushing this pretty hard right now. So it seems like, once again, this has been talked about in Georgia for quite some time. And, I've in the past not really quite so sure how seriously I've taken it. But it seems like this push right now is truly a little bit more serious than some of the previous stuff has been. So if you're looking towards a path for legalization for sports betting in Georgia, pretty good story about that in the AJC here today. Also, 15 things this weekend with St. Patrick's Day weekend on tap. More of that online, ajc.com as well. R.S. Andrews, you can check them out online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. If your water heater goes out, you don't want a cold shower here this weekend. You want nice, warm water coming through those shower heads and things like that. So R.S. Andrews, one you turn to for your plumbing needs. Find them online, rsandrews.com. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here Monday. Big show already on tap with just the stuff we already have planned, so that's going to be good. All of it on the way. DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We will look forward to talking to you then.